Ferdinand Magellan, written by S.E. Virgilio. Focus question. Who was Ferdinand Magellan, and was his final expedition a success? An age of exploration. Imagine traveling to a far-off place with a limited understanding of what lies ahead and no modern technology to help you find your way. This was the experience of 16th century European explorers. Traveling in wooden sailing ships and with little to guide them, they set out on epic journeys across vast seas. One of the most daring and well-known expeditions was that of Ferdinand Magellan. The Portuguese sea captain led the first expedition to sail around the world. A son of nobles. Ferdinand Magellan, born in 1480, was the son of Portuguese nobles. As a boy, he served as a page in the royal court. There, young Ferdinand heard members of the court talk about the voyages of prominent explorers. Magellan was fascinated by these stories of sailing to distant lands. He wanted to learn as much as he could about navigation and become an explorer himself. When he was old enough, he joined the Portuguese Navy. Magellan started out as a crew member on a ship captained by a respected Portuguese commander. The crew sailed the waters along the African coast and east to India. Their mission was to assert Portuguese control over key trade routes to the Far East. From 1506 to 1512, Magellan fought in many important and successful sea battles along the trade routes. By 1514, the Portuguese ruled the waters from Africa to India and held key ports near the Spice Islands. The spice trade. Spices were big business in 16th century Europe. Spice traders could make a fortune importing fragrant herbs and powders. Most spices had to be brought from Asia, especially from an area then known as the Spice Islands, the Maluku Islands in Indonesia. This made them expensive and hard to get. Spices such as cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, and black pepper were so valuable that people used them as currency. It was once thought that people sought spices to hide the taste of food that had gone bad. This was not true. People liked spices for the same reasons we like them, to liven up meals. Betrayals and rivalries. In 1512, Magellan returned to Portugal. After a year there, he was sent on a new mission to seize a North African seaport. During the fight, Magellan's leg was badly wounded. When he returned home, he asked King Manuel to increase his pay as a reward for his effort. The king refused Magellan's requests multiple times. He suggested that if Magellan was unhappy, he could work elsewhere. Betrayed and angry, Magellan decided to test the king's resolve. In 1517, he went to Seville, Spain, and offered his services to King Charles I. King Charles knew of Magellan's reputation as a skilled navigator. He knew Magellan was eager for new adventures and discoveries. Magellan told the king he could help Spain challenge Portugal's hold on the spice trade. He would help Spain establish its own trade routes to the treasures of the Far East. Spain and Portugal were fierce rivals when it came to trade. Spain had signed an agreement with Portugal that prevented it from occupying newly discovered lands to the east. Spanish ships were not welcome in Portuguese ports along the African coast. Without ports where they could restock supplies and food, Spanish ships could not make the long journey to the Spice Islands. Portugal held the trade routes to the east. Magellan wanted to find another route by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean toward the Americas. He believed there was a water route through South America. Although other explorers had tried and failed to find such a route, Magellan was sure he could succeed. He persuaded King Charles to approve an expedition. Setting sail under the Spanish flag. King Charles approved the expedition in March 1518, but things started slowly. Many sailors in Spain were suspicious of a Portuguese commander. The officials who helped organize Spanish exploration delayed the project more than once. The expedition was given 5 old ships: the flagship Trinidad and escort vessels San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago. Getting crews for the 5 ships was a real problem. Spanish sailors mistrusted Magellan. The number of Portuguese seamen he could recruit for the voyage was limited. The challenge of putting together trustworthy and disciplined crews would later cause great difficulties for the expedition. Finally, on September 20th, 1519, the Magellan expedition, with over 250 men, set sail from Spain to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Struggle after struggle. By the end of November, the expedition had made it across the Atlantic and passed south of the equator. The ships hugged the coast of South America as they continued south. As they traveled, one crew member collected data about the geography, climate, plants, animals, and people they encountered. Whenever they came to the mouth of a river, Magellan sent out escort ships to see where it led. He was searching for a water route that connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, known as the South Sea at the time. It was in this sea that the Spice Islands lay. The search continued with no success. Magellan's crew grew frustrated and angry. They had been at sea for months, and many were weary and sick. On April 1st and 2nd, 1520, in a bay off the coast of Patagonia, several of the expedition's Spanish captains staged a mutiny against their Portuguese commander. Magellan managed to beat back the rebellion and dealt with the traitors harshly. One captain was executed, and another was abandoned ashore. Shortly after, the Santiago ran aground and was wrecked. Its crew was rescued and divided up among the expedition's 4 remaining ships. Despite these troubles, Magellan continued his mission. In October 1520, over a year after departing Spain, the expedition found itself close to the southern tip of South America in what looked like a large bay. Navigating the rough waters was too much for the captain of the San Antonio. He deserted the expedition and sailed back to Spain with his crew. Magellan sent his 2 remaining escort ships, the Concepcion and the Victoria, to scout the bay with orders to return in 5 days. A terrible storm hit the area, and Magellan feared the ships were lost. On the 5th day, he prepared the Trinidad to return to Spain, but caught sight of the escort ship's sails. They had returned with good news. The bay wasn't a bay at all, but rather a strait. The expedition continued into the strait. After 38 days sailing rough seas, they finally reached the Pacific Ocean in November. Magellan gave it the name Pacific for its peaceful waters. More serious than seasickness. Early sailors spent months away from land and sources of fresh food. As a result, many got scurvy, a condition caused by a lack of vitamin C. Scurvy caused joint pain and blood spots beneath the skin. Victims became too weak to walk or even eat, and if untreated, they died. Magellan lost about half his crew to scurvy. Beriberi is another illness that plagued early sailors. It is a disease of the nervous system caused by a lack of the mineral thiamine. The name comes from an Asian language and means I cannot, I cannot. Victims' nerves became so damaged that they were unable to do the simplest of tasks before eventually dying. It was far from smooth sailing for the expedition, however. Magellan made a few navigational errors that were costly. Like many other European sea captains, he badly underestimated the distance between South America and Asia. He also expected to find islands along the way where the ships could stock up on supplies and fresh food. Instead, the crew went without fresh food for 3 months. Sanitation on the ships was poor. Disease spread and 19 sailors died. When the expedition finally reached the island of Guam in March 1521, the crew was in dire shape. The great expedition ends. After a brief rest, the remaining 3 ships left Guam and sailed west. They landed on the island of Cebu in the Philippines in April 1521. Magellan began acting strangely. He mistakenly believed he had reached the Spice Islands and declared that he was now the sole European allowed to trade with the native people. Later, he became involved in a dispute between tribal chiefs. He brought some of his men to another island to show a band of native warriors that they were no match for European weapons. Instead, the outnumbered Spanish were quickly defeated. Magellan, the expedition's fearless leader, was killed in the battle along with 12 members of his crew. Unsung heroes of the expedition. 2 men helped bring Magellan's expedition fame and success. One was Antonio Pigafetta, who traveled with Magellan as a passenger. He kept a journal of the voyage that included details about native people and animals. His notes were eventually published in Europe. Juan Sebastián del Cano was a Basque sailor who took command of the Victoria after Magellan's death. Although credit for circling the globe is often given to Magellan, it was actually Del Cano who achieved that milestone. After the defeat, the Concepcion was burned since it was in no condition to sail. The Trinidad and Victoria traveled west to the Spice Islands. The ships picked up a small cargo of spices and continued west along the Portuguese trade route, but the Trinidad began to leak and stayed behind. The Victoria, commanded by a Basque sailor, took on some of the Trinidad's crew and sailed across the Indian Ocean and around the southern tip of Africa. In September 1522, the ship limped into port with just 18 crew members, the sole survivors of the grueling 2-year voyage around the world. Ferdinand Magellan's mission was to establish a flourishing Spanish trade route to Asia. In that sense, the mission was a failure. It was, however, an incredible navigational success. It showed that it was possible to reach Asia by sailing west rather than east. The Victoria circumnavigated the globe and confirmed the true size and scope of Earth and its vast oceans. Magellan may not have completed the voyage, but his leadership and courage helped expand knowledge of the world and clear the decks for future exploration.